In the summer of 1976, a charter fishing boat vanished from the Outer Banks with $2.9 million in cash aboard. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The vessel disappeared as if the Atlantic had simply swallowed it whole, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would haunt investigators for nearly 5 decades. But in 2023, a routine coral restoration dive off Cape Hatteras uncovered something that shouldn't have been there, wedged deep inside a reef formation that had grown around it over the years. What they found wasn't just treasure. It was the first tangible proof of what really happened during those final hours on the water, and it would unravel a crime that had been perfectly concealed beneath 47 years of saltwater and silence. The boat was called the Marlin's Dream, a 42-foot sport fishing vessel that specialized in deep-sea charters for wealthy clients seeking trophy catches in the Gulf Stream. On July 23, 1976, it departed from Oregon Inlet with 5 passengers aboard, each carrying substantial amounts of cash intended for a private offshore transaction that was never fully explained in the official reports. The vessel was scheduled to return by sunset, but as darkness fell across the barrier islands, the Marlin's Dream remained missing. No emergency beacon had been activated, no radio contact had been established, and no debris field was ever located despite an extensive Coast Guard search that lasted nearly 2 weeks. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The passengers were not typical fishing enthusiasts. According to harbor records, they had chartered the vessel not for recreation but for what the boat's captain had logged as a specialized offshore meeting. The group included Marcus Whitfield, a real estate developer from Virginia Beach who had been under federal investigation for tax evasion; Raymond Torres, a Miami-based import businessman with suspected ties to Caribbean smuggling operations; and Dr. Patricia Henley, a physician from Norfolk, whose medical practice had recently been scrutinized for unusual cash transactions. The final 2 passengers were identified only by aliases in the departure manifest, suggesting they preferred to remain anonymous even in official documentation. What made their disappearance particularly suspicious was the timing. Just days before the charter, a series of high-value drug seizures along the Carolina coast had disrupted several major trafficking networks. Federal agents had been closing in on a money laundering operation that moved cash through seemingly legitimate businesses, using fishing charters and recreational boat trips as cover for transferring funds between criminal organizations. The Marlin's Dream had never been directly linked to these activities, but its sudden vanishing coincided perfectly with the collapse of the broader investigation. Captain Billy Rawson, who operated the vessel, was a lifelong waterman with an impeccable reputation among the charter fishing community. He had worked these waters for over 20 years, knew every sandbar and current, and had never lost a client or suffered a serious accident. His experience made the complete disappearance even more baffling. Rawson was not the type to take unnecessary risks, especially with paying customers aboard, and he was known for maintaining constant radio contact with the harbor during longer trips. The weather on July 23rd had been ideal for offshore fishing. Seas were calm, visibility was excellent, and no storms were forecast for the area. The Coast Guard investigation found no environmental factors that could have contributed to an accident, no equipment failures that might have caused the vessel to sink, and no evidence of collision with other boats or marine hazards. The Marlin's Dream had simply sailed beyond the horizon and never returned. In the days following the disappearance, federal agents interviewed dozens of people connected to the missing passengers. They discovered that Marcus Whitfield had recently liquidated several properties and converted the proceeds to cash, claiming he intended to invest in a new development project in the Caribbean. Raymond Torres had been spotted making large deposits at various banks throughout North Carolina in the weeks before the charter. Deposits that were always just below the federal reporting threshold. Dr. Henley had closed her medical practice abruptly, telling colleagues she was relocating to start fresh somewhere else, though she had never specified where. The two unidentified passengers proved impossible to trace. The names on the manifest were confirmed to be false, and no reliable physical descriptions existed since they had boarded the vessel before dawn to avoid drawing attention. Harbor security footage from that era was limited and poor quality, showing only shadowy figures carrying duffel bags and boarding the boat in darkness. As weeks turned to months, the case transitioned from an active search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. The Drug Enforcement Administration took over from the Coast Guard, treating the disappearance as a potential drug-related incident rather than a maritime accident. Agents theorized that the Marlin's Dream had been involved in a cash transfer operation that went wrong, possibly resulting in violence at sea and the deliberate scuttling of the vessel to eliminate evidence. But without physical proof, the investigation stalled. No bodies were recovered, no wreckage was found, and no witnesses came forward with information about what had happened during the charter. The case file grew thick with theories and speculation, but thin on actionable evidence. By 1978, active investigation had ceased, and the disappearance of the Marlin's Dream was reclassified as a cold case. The families of the missing passengers received conflicting information from authorities. Some were told their relatives had likely perished in an accident at sea. Others were informed that the individuals might have been involved in criminal activity and could potentially be alive but in hiding. Insurance companies refused to pay out death benefits without confirmed fatalities, leaving several families in financial limbo for years. Meanwhile, rumors persisted throughout the Outer Banks fishing community about what had really happened. Some charter boat captains claimed they had seen the Marlin's Dream heading south toward Cape Hatteras on the morning of July 23rd, far from its reported fishing destination. Others suggested the vessel had been spotted near Diamond Shoals, a treacherous area known for shipwrecks and dangerous currents where few recreational boats ventured. One particularly persistent story involved a commercial fisherman who claimed he had witnessed an explosion on the horizon during the early evening hours of July 23rd. He reported seeing a brief flash of light followed by a column of smoke. But when he radioed the Coast Guard, no other vessels in the area confirmed the sighting. The incident was logged but never verified, and the fisherman later recanted his statement, saying he might have been mistaken about the date and location. As the years passed, the Marlin's Dream became part of local maritime folklore, joining the ranks of legendary ghost ships and unsolved mysteries that dotted the Outer Banks' dangerous waters. Tour guides would mention the vanished charter boat when taking visitors past Oregon Inlet, and diving enthusiasts occasionally searched for the wreck during recreational expeditions, though none ever reported finding anything significant. The cash that had disappeared with the vessel took on an almost mythical quality in these retellings. The exact amount was never officially confirmed, but estimates ranged from $1.5 million to over $3 million, depending on which source was consulted. Some accounts claimed the money had been intended for a drug purchase that never took place. Others suggested it was payment for services in a larger criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond the North Carolina coast. What no one could have predicted was that the truth had been resting quietly on the ocean floor for decades, slowly being encased in coral growth and marine sediment, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it back to the surface. The Marlin's Dream and its secrets had not vanished into thin air, as investigators had long assumed. Instead, they had sunk to the bottom in relatively shallow water, close enough to shore that recreational divers could have discovered them at any time during the intervening years. The breakthrough came not from law enforcement or treasure hunters, but from an environmental restoration project that had nothing to do with the decades-old mystery. In March 2023, the North Carolina Coastal Conservation Alliance launched an ambitious coral reef rehabilitation program designed to combat the effects of climate change and pollution along the Outer Banks. Marine biologists and volunteer divers were systematically surveying damaged reef systems, documenting coral bleaching, and installing artificial reef structures to encourage new growth. Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biology professor from Duke University, was leading a team of graduate students in mapping the seafloor topography near Diamond Shoals when they encountered an unusual formation approximately 60 feet below the surface. What appeared to be a natural coral outcropping showed geometric patterns that seemed inconsistent with organic growth. The structure was roughly rectangular, measuring about 8 feet in length and 4 feet in width, and it was covered in decades of marine incrustation that had transformed it into what looked like a natural part of the reef ecosystem. Initially, the team assumed they had discovered the remains of an old shipping container or piece of industrial debris that had been colonized by marine life over time. Such discoveries were common in these waters, where centuries of maritime traffic had left behind countless artifacts on the ocean floor. But as they began carefully removing the coral growth to document the underlying structure, they realized this was something far more significant. Beneath the layers of marine vegetation and calcium carbonate deposits, they found the unmistakable outline of a boat's hull. The vessel was lying on its side, partially buried in sand and sediment, with its cabin structure collapsed but still recognizable. More importantly, the boat's registration numbers were still visible on the stern, though they required careful cleaning and enhanced photography to read clearly. When Dr. Chen's team cross-referenced those numbers with Coast Guard databases, they made a discovery that would electrify law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The wreck was the Marlin's Dream. The condition of the vessel told a story that differed dramatically from the theories that had dominated the original investigation. This was not a boat that had been destroyed by an explosion or torn apart by rough seas. The hull showed evidence of deliberate scuttling, with holes that appeared to have been punched through the bottom from the inside. The cabin had been stripped of most equipment and personal belongings before the vessel went down, suggesting that someone had taken time to remove valuable or incriminating items before sinking the boat. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. Wedged deep inside what had once been the boat's forward storage compartment, protected by the collapsed cabin structure and encased in coral growth, was a waterproof metal container about the size of a large toolbox. The chest had been secured with heavy chains and padlocks, and its placement suggested it had been deliberately hidden rather than simply stored aboard the vessel. The recovery operation required specialized equipment and careful coordination with multiple agencies. The FBI's underwater recovery team was called in to ensure proper evidence handling, while marine archaeologists documented the wreck site to preserve its historical and legal significance. The process took nearly 2 weeks, with divers working in shifts to carefully extract the container without damaging its contents or disturbing the surrounding coral ecosystem. When the chest was finally brought to the surface and transported to a secure facility for examination, investigators faced their first major challenge in decades. The container had been underwater for 47 years, and while its waterproof design had protected the contents from direct exposure to seawater, the effects of pressure, corrosion, and time had taken their toll. The locks had seized completely, and the metal showed signs of structural weakness that made opening it a delicate operation. Forensic specialists used precision cutting tools to carefully access the container while preserving as much evidence as possible. What they found inside defied every theory that had been proposed about the Marlin's Dream disappearance. The chest contained not just money, but a carefully organized collection of documents, photographs, and other materials that painted a picture of a criminal conspiracy far more complex than anyone had imagined. The cash was there, bundled in deteriorated but still recognizable stacks of bills from the 1970s. Preliminary counts suggested the total was close to $2.9 million, confirming the upper estimates of what had been aboard the vessel when it vanished. But the money was only part of the story. Mixed in with the currency were detailed records of financial transactions, coded communications between various criminal organizations, and what appeared to be evidence of a money laundering operation that had extended far beyond the North Carolina coast. Among the most intriguing discoveries were a series of photographs showing the 5 passengers aboard the Marlin's Dream during what appeared to be their final voyage. The images had been taken with an underwater camera and sealed in plastic, preserving them remarkably well despite the decades underwater. They showed the group in what appeared to be a business meeting, with documents spread across a table and the mysterious cash visible in the background. But it was the final photograph in the sequence that provided the most shocking revelation. The image showed only 4 people instead of 5, and one of them was pointing a handgun at the camera. The implication was clear. Something had gone terribly wrong during that offshore meeting, and at least one person had not survived the encounter. The photograph had been taken by someone who knew they were in mortal danger and had chosen to document the evidence rather than attempt to escape. The documents recovered from the chest revealed the true purpose of the July 23rd charter. The Marlin's Dream had not been carrying passengers to a simple business meeting, but rather to a final settlement in a dispute between competing criminal organizations. The $2.9 million represented proceeds from a drug trafficking operation that had been disrupted by federal agents, and the offshore meeting was intended to divide the remaining assets before the participants went into hiding or fled the country. According to the recovered papers, Marcus Whitfield had been serving as a financial intermediary, using his real estate connections to launder drug money through property transactions. Raymond Torres was revealed to be a key figure in a Caribbean smuggling network that moved cocaine and marijuana through the Outer Banks using fishing boats and pleasure craft as cover. Dr. Patricia Henley had been providing medical services to injured criminals and had been storing cash payments in her medical practice as part of the laundering scheme. The 2 unidentified passengers were finally revealed through the documents to be Vincent Calabrese, an enforcer for a Philadelphia crime family, and Maria Santos, a courier who specialized in moving large amounts of cash across international borders. Both had been brought in to oversee the final distribution of the money and ensure that all parties honored their agreements about future silence regarding the collapsed operation. But the meeting had devolved into violence when suspicions arose about who had been cooperating with federal investigators. The documents suggested that at least one member of the group had been providing information to law enforcement, and the others had become convinced that eliminating the informant was necessary for their collective survival. What followed was a deadly confrontation that left multiple people dead, and the survivors facing the problem of disposing of both the bodies and the evidence. The solution had been as brutal as it was effective. The survivors had weighted down the bodies and thrown them overboard in deep water, where they would never be recovered. They had then deliberately scuttled the Marlin's Dream in shallower water, but not before hiding the chest containing the money and evidence in a location where they could potentially recover it later if circumstances allowed. The plan had been for the remaining conspirators to wait several years before attempting to retrieve the cash, allowing the investigation to cool down and public attention to move elsewhere. But something had prevented them from ever returning to claim their hidden treasure. Whether they had been arrested for other crimes, killed by rival criminals, or simply decided the risk was too great would become the next phase of the investigation. As news of the discovery spread through law enforcement circles, agents began the painstaking process of connecting the 47-year-old evidence to current cases and ongoing investigations. Several of the names mentioned in the recovered documents were linked to unsolved crimes from the same era, and the financial records provided new leads in cases that had been considered closed for decades. The recovery of the Marlin's Dream and its hidden cargo had accomplished something that investigators in 1976 could never have imagined. It had transformed a mysterious disappearance into a solvable crime, complete with physical evidence, documentary proof, and a clear timeline of events. The ocean had preserved not just the money, but the truth itself, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal secrets that had been buried beneath decades of salt water and silence. The forensic analysis of the recovered documents revealed details that sent shockwaves through multiple law enforcement agencies. Hidden within the waterlogged papers were banking records showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, detailed maps of smuggling routes through the Outer Banks, and most significantly, a handwritten list of law enforcement officials who had allegedly been receiving payments for protection and information. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a drug money dispute had exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of regional law enforcement. Among the most damaging evidence was a series of coded communications between the conspirators and their contacts within various agencies. The messages, written on letterhead from legitimate businesses, used maritime terminology to discuss bribes, evidence suppression, and advance warnings about pending raids. One particularly incriminating document appeared to be a receipt for $50,000 paid to someone identified only as the Lighthouse, apparently a code name for a high-ranking official who had been providing intelligence about federal investigations. The FBI immediately launched an internal affairs investigation to identify any current or former agents who might have been compromised. Several retired officers from the original 1976 investigation were brought in for questioning, though most maintained they had no knowledge of any corruption within their ranks. However, the documentary evidence was compelling enough to warrant reopening dozens of cases from the same time period, many of which had been closed due to lack of evidence or witnesses who had suddenly become uncooperative. Dr. Chen's marine biology team found themselves at the center of what had become a major federal investigation. Their routine coral restoration project had uncovered one of the most significant criminal cases in North Carolina history, and they were required to provide detailed testimony about the discovery process and the condition of the wreck site. The irony was not lost on investigators that an environmental protection effort had succeeded where decades of criminal investigation had failed. The recovered photographs proved particularly valuable in identifying the participants and understanding the sequence of events aboard the Marlin's Dream. Digital enhancement techniques revealed facial features that had been obscured by decades underwater, and forensic experts were able to match several individuals to known criminal suspects from the 1970s. The images also showed the interior layout of the boat, which helped investigators understand how the confrontation had unfolded and where the violence had occurred. One photograph in particular drew intense scrutiny from behavioral analysts. It showed Vincent Calabresi, the Philadelphia enforcer, sitting calmly at a table, while Maria Santos, the courier, appeared to be arguing with someone outside the camera's field of view. The body language suggested rising tension, and Calabresi's hand was positioned near what appeared to be a concealed weapon. This image, taken perhaps minutes before the shooting began, captured the final moments before the meeting descended into chaos. The financial records recovered from the chest painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than typical drug trafficking. The money laundering scheme had involved legitimate businesses across 3 states, with cash being moved through real estate transactions, medical practices, and even charitable organizations. Dr. Patricia Henley's medical clinic had been particularly effective as a front, since cash payments for medical services were common and rarely scrutinized by banking authorities. Marcus Whitfield's real estate empire had served as the primary washing mechanism for the dirty money. properties would be purchased with cash from drug sales, then quickly resold to generate clean funds that could be deposited in legitimate bank accounts. The recovered documents showed at least 47 properties had been involved in the scheme, with a total value exceeding $12 million. Many of these properties were still owned by shell companies that investigators were now working to trace. The revelation that Raymond Torres had been operating a Caribbean smuggling network through the Outer Banks explained several unsolved incidents from the mid-1970s. Coast Guard records showed numerous reports of suspicious boat activity in the same waters where the Marlin's Dream had vanished, including several vessels that had been spotted dumping cargo overboard when approached by patrol boats. The recovered communications suggested these incidents were part of Torres's operation, with boats jettisoning drug shipments when they believed they were under surveillance. As investigators dug deeper into the recovered evidence, they began to understand why the conspiracy had ultimately collapsed. The documents revealed that federal agents had been closing in on the operation for months before the final meeting aboard the Marlin's Dream. Several key participants had been placed under surveillance, and at least 2 had been approached by investigators seeking cooperation. The paranoia and mistrust that followed had made the offshore meeting inevitable, as each conspirator sought to protect themselves by eliminating potential witnesses. The identity of the informant who had triggered the deadly confrontation remained unclear from the recovered documents. Several participants had been acting suspiciously in the weeks before the meeting, and the communications showed that accusations were flying in multiple directions. Vincent Calabrese had suspected Maria Santos of cooperating with authorities, while Torres had become convinced that Dr. Henley was providing information to federal agents. Meanwhile, Whitfield had been overheard making telephone calls that others believed were to law enforcement contacts. The forensic examination of the boat itself provided additional clues about what had happened during those final hours. Ballistics experts found bullet holes in the cabin walls, and chemical analysis revealed traces of blood that had somehow survived nearly 5 decades underwater. The pattern of damage suggested that multiple weapons had been fired in the confined space, and at least 3 people had been shot during the confrontation. The deliberate scuttling of the vessel had been carried out with surprising sophistication. Someone with maritime knowledge had carefully selected the location, ensuring the boat would sink in water deep enough to avoid casual discovery, but shallow enough to allow for potential future recovery. The holes punched in the hull were positioned to flood the boat quickly, while keeping the forward compartment containing the hidden chest relatively intact. Most intriguingly, the evidence suggested that not all the participants had died during the confrontation. The recovered documents included what appeared to be a survival plan, with detailed instructions for how the survivors should disappear and avoid detection by law enforcement. Bank account numbers, false identity documents, and contact information for criminal associates in other states were all carefully organized, suggesting that at least one person had expected to leave the boat alive. This revelation prompted investigators to launch a nationwide search for any surviving conspirators who might still be alive after 47 years. Computer databases were searched for the various aliases mentioned in the documents, and aging photographs from the recovered materials were run through facial recognition systems to identify potential matches with current criminal suspects. The search yielded several promising leads. A man matching Vincent Calabrese's description had been arrested in Miami in 1982 on weapons charges, though he had provided a different name and had been released after serving a brief sentence. Maria Santos had apparently used her expertise in moving cash across borders to establish a new identity, and investigators found evidence suggesting she had been living in Mexico under an assumed name until at least the early 1990s. Dr. Patricia Henley's medical license had been quietly revoked in Virginia in 1978, officially for failure to maintain malpractice insurance, though investigators now suspected the real reason had been related to her involvement in the money laundering operation. She had disappeared from public records entirely after 1979, but recent computer searches had identified a woman with a similar background working at a free clinic in Oregon under a slightly different name. The most shocking discovery came when investigators attempted to trace Marcus Whitfield's real estate holdings. Several of the properties mentioned in the recovered documents were still generating income through rental agreements and property management companies. The current ownership structure was so complex that it took forensic accountants weeks to unravel, but they eventually determined that someone had been collecting profits from these investments for decades. Bank records showed that rental income and property appreciation had generated millions of dollars over the years, all flowing into accounts controlled by a trust with deliberately obscured beneficiaries. The sophisticated financial structure suggested that at least one of the conspirators had not only survived the confrontation aboard the Marlin's Dream, but had successfully claimed their share of the criminal proceeds and parlayed it into a legitimate fortune. This discovery transformed the investigation from a historical curiosity into an active criminal case. If one or more of the conspirators were still alive and had been benefiting from their crimes for nearly 5 decades, they could potentially be charged with money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that had no statute of limitations when connected to ongoing criminal enterprises. The FBI established a task force specifically dedicated to tracking down any surviving members of the conspiracy. Agents began interviewing elderly residents of communities where the suspects might have relocated, showing enhanced photographs and asking about newcomers who had arrived in the late 1970s with unexplained wealth. The investigation expanded to include retirement communities, assisted living facilities, and nursing homes across multiple states. Meanwhile, the recovery of the Marlin's Dream had captured public attention in ways that investigators had not anticipated. News of the discovery spread rapidly through social media and maritime enthusiast communities, generating hundreds of tips from people who claimed to have information about the case. Most of these leads proved worthless, but several provided valuable insights into suspicious activities from the 1970s that had never been reported to authorities. One particularly intriguing tip came from a retired charter boat captain who remembered seeing the Marlin's Dream on the morning of July 23, 1976. He had been returning from an early fishing trip when he spotted the distinctive vessel heading toward Diamond Shoals, far from its reported destination. What made his account credible was his detailed description of the boat's occupants, which matched the enhanced photographs recovered from the underwater chest. According to the captain's recollection, he had noticed that the passengers appeared tense and were not engaged in typical fishing preparations. Instead, they were gathered around what looked like paperwork spread across a table in the cabin. He had also observed that the boat was riding lower in the water than normal, suggesting it was carrying significant additional weight beyond the usual fishing equipment and supplies. The witness had not thought much of the encounter at the time, assuming it was simply a group of business associates combining work with recreation. But the discovery of the wreck and the accompanying publicity had triggered his memory of the unusual circumstances. His testimony provided investigators with valuable confirmation of the timeline and helped establish that the deadly meeting had been planned well in advance, rather than being a spontaneous confrontation. As the investigation continued to expand, forensic accountants working on the financial aspects of the case made another startling discovery. The money laundering operation exposed by the recovered documents had been far more extensive than initially realized, involving not just the 5 individuals aboard the Marlin's Dream, but dozens of other participants across multiple criminal organizations. The scheme had operated like a financial services company for criminals, offering money laundering, asset protection, and financial planning services to drug traffickers, arms dealers, and other criminal enterprises throughout the southeastern United States. The $2.9 million recovered from the underwater chest represented only a small fraction of the total funds that had been processed through the network over several years of operation. Bank records subpoenaed as part of the expanded investigation revealed that the conspiracy had laundered an estimated $50 million between 1973 and 1976, taking a percentage of each transaction as profit, while providing their criminal clients with clean money that could be invested in legitimate businesses or moved offshore to avoid detection by law enforcement. The sophistication of the operation explained why federal agents had struggled to build cases against the participants despite years of investigation. The money laundering network had been designed by people with extensive knowledge of banking regulations and law enforcement techniques, allowing them to stay one step ahead of investigators while building what appeared to be legitimate business empires.